So, my name is Sarah Nouwen. I'm one of the 4 co-directors of the Academy of European Law. Arnulf Becker-Lorca is with us today. He's another of the directors of the Academy. And the directors of the Academy organize these summer schools, and in that capacity I've got the great privilege to welcome all our summer school participants to this distinguished lecture. I'm also welcoming here in a different capacity, and that is as the editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law. I would like to welcome everybody in this room, but also everybody online. I would like to welcome also everybody who watches and listens now and in the future who may be looking at this video. While thousands of people are being starved in Gaza, Israel and Iran are exchanging bombs, rioters in Northern Ireland are throwing stones through the windows of foreigners, Sudanese civilians are being attacked from all sides, and refugees continue to drown in the sea to which many of us will soon go for their holidays. We have gathered together to reflect on the question, if the world is a family, what kind of family is it? It is the question that Professor Susan Marks raised for her foreword in the first issue of the European Journal of International Law of volume 36, 2025. And it is open access, so do go and read it if you haven't done so yet. The EJL Forward is an annual lead article in the journal that is designed to give a distinguished author the space to explore the state of the field in a particular area of international law, permitting both a broader and a deeper sweep of the field of a topic than a regular article, or to put a topic on the agenda of international law. In 2025, that distinguished author is Professor Susan Marks, Professor of International Law at the London School of Economics. She was previously at King's College London and at Cambridge, where she was also a fellow of Emmanuel College. She is the author of many other great works. To mention but a few, The Riddle of All Constitutions, International Law, Democracy, and the Critique of Ideology, the Hirsch-Lauterpact Memorial Lectures, Trucanini's Stare, Reconsidering Dignity in Theory and Practice, but also beautiful articles like Apologizing for Torture, or False Contingency, or Backlash, the Undeclared War Against Human Rights, each and every one of which has changed how many of us see the field of international law. With this said, I would like to give Susan the floor for her distinguished lecture.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those incredibly kind words. It's wonderful to be here. I was at the European University Institute many decades ago working on a research project with Professor Nino Cassese. I don't know whether that name rings any bells for anyone, but he was an esteemed jurist, international lawyer from this country. Professor at the University of Florence, and then on secondment to the EUI, and subsequently became a judge of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So wonderful to be back and in this extraordinary building. Well, I understand that most of you are here for, or some of you at any rate, are here for a summer school entitled Peace Negotiations, What's Law Got to Do with It? I'm currently, for various personal reasons, living partly in India, where the ongoing conflict with Pakistan over Kashmir recently flared up, as you may have read, after a terrible atrocity in which 26 tourists were killed by some armed men at a place called Pahalgam. Law, of course, has quite a lot to do with that conflict and with the peace negotiations arising out of it. To speak only of international law, the conflict itself goes back to the partition of British India in 1947, an exercise in international legal state-making and boundary delimitation with profound and manifestly fateful consequences for the contested status of Kashmir. Fast forward to the present, and at the center of the current peace negotiations is a treaty, the Indus Waters Treaty, concluded between the two countries in 1960 to fix their arrangements for sharing the water resources of that river and its tributaries on which both states depend. After the Pahalgam attack, India announced that it was suspending the Indus Waters Treaty. Partly, it seems, to punish Pakistan for what India takes to be its sponsorship of Kashmir-related terrorism, and partly because of long-standing concerns on India's part about the alleged unfairness on its side of the treaty's water-sharing regime. Looking online for something to read about this situation, I came across a book by an Indian author named M.P. Ajit Kumar with the title India-Pakistan Relations, The Story of a Fractured Fraternity. The subtitle, The Story of a Fractured Fraternity, to describe the story of India-Pakistan relations as the story of a fractured fraternity is obviously to suggest that the two countries can be compared to brothers who have fallen out with one another. It is to suggest that this part of South Asia has the character of a family riven by conflict, a broken family in which the loving bonds between siblings have been replaced by a disturbing estrangement. A moment's reflection will remind you that used in that metaphorical kind of way, the family and family relationships are really quite pervasive. If you go into a certain clothes shop in London, I can vouch for the fact that you are likely to be approached by a sales assistant and asked whether you are a member of their brand family, and if you're not already a member, whether you'd like to sign up to become one. If you're interested in the history and geography of languages, you will have read about language families, such as the Indo-European, the Sino-Tibetan, and the Austronesian language families. And as we've just seen, it's not just a matter of the family itself used as a metaphor, it's also a matter of particular family relationships. Some of you may be or have been members of fraternities or sororities at colleges in the United States. Some of you may come from countries in which a certain historical figure is regarded as the father, or less often mother, of the nation, as Gandhi is in India. Well, what can be heard in London shops and US colleges, in language classifications and nationalist discourses, and in commentary on regional disputes between post-colonial states, among many other spheres, can also be heard in discussions of the world as a whole. That's what I want to talk to you about in this lecture, the use of familial metaphors to refer to the world as a whole. In particular, I'm going to focus your attention on three family-related tropes that have been, and in some cases still remain, prominent, not least in international legal circles. First, the human family. Second, the family of nations. And third, the child or children as emblems of the future in climate change discourse. I'll be inviting you to think about what it means to represent the world through these tropes, how they affect our understanding of the world, but also how they affect our understanding of the family. After all, the family is not exactly a unitary or uniform phenomenon. Most people in the world, of course, have been born into and remain connected with some kind of family. But what kind of family? Some families are sites of care, security, and togetherness. Others, too many, are sites of violence, cruelty, and servitude. To some people, a normal family is a couple, whether married or also unmarried, whether only straight or also gay or non-binary, and their children, if any. To other people, a normal family is a much wider, perhaps looser, and certainly more multi-generational grouping of relatives. And that's not even to begin talking about the changing forms and meanings of the family over time, across history, in other words. Here, then, is an intriguing observation with which to kick off our investigation into the representation of the world as a family. Whereas we very well know that the family is something wildly diverse, constantly shifting, and deeply contested, virtually none of that is reflected in the three international legal tropes to which I've just referred and on which I'll be concentrating. Instead, these familial metaphors presuppose an idea of the family, the literal family, that is timeless, universal, and self-evident. How so, and why does this matter? Well, to consider those questions, let's turn now to the first of the tropes, the concept of the human family. This concept appears right up front in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the very first paragraph. That was the book, sorry, I forgot about that, I had that slide. So the concept of the human family appears right up front in the Universal Declaration in the very first paragraph of its preamble, where we read that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And then familial language recurs in the very first substantive article of the Declaration, which reads, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit, again, of brotherhood. So again, this idea of fraternity, a particular family relationship coming back. It seems that this familial language, both sets of familial language, were introduced into the Declaration by the French jurist René Cassin, who, as many of you will know, played a central role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, Cassin put in something like that language. It wasn't exactly the same in his first draft. He referred to acting towards one another as brothers, but basically in slightly modified form, something like what he drafted was eventually adopted, and it's what we see in these provisions. What's striking to register here is that apart from one or two questions that were raised in the debates about the gender bias of the term brotherhood, and by the way, that concern, actually I also have it, that's René Cassin, that concern about the gender bias associated with the term brotherhood was squashed by the chairperson of the drafting committee, Eleanor Roosevelt. Anyway, apart from that brief discussion, Cassin's slightly modified language was adopted for the Declaration with virtually no discussion. There was, and in the commentary that's emerged over the decades about the Universal Declaration still is, no discussion of what it might mean to figure humankind as a family. Cassin had earlier said that human unity, solidarity, and equality should be the guiding principles of the Universal Declaration. But there was no discussion of whether, if that was the case, the metaphor of a family was a good vehicle for communicating those principles. That's what I meant about presupposing an idea of the family that's self-evident, here self-evident, as a paradigm of unity, solidarity, and equality. Well, at around the same time as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was coming into being, another project of a different sort was getting going in the United States. And it will be instructive, I think, to touch on this other project because it also thematized the idea of the human family. But unlike the Universal Declaration, it was at the time, and has continued to be, the subject of a huge amount of critical discussion and commentary. And this other project was not a document or an international instrument like the Universal Declaration. It was an exhibition of photography entitled The Family of Man. Some of you may have heard of this exhibition or seen this famous catalogue that was published for it. The exhibition was first shown at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955. And it's widely regarded, still to this day, as one of the most successful photographic exhibitions ever staged, measured in part by the number of people who saw it. It traveled around the world, and I'll mention something about that in a moment. The general idea of this exhibition was to showcase what the curator regarded as the essential similarity that underlies the tremendous diversity of the world. The curator was a man originally from Luxembourg who'd moved to the United States called Edward Steichen. And as he put it, he organized the show to, now quoting, express my own very firm belief that we are all alike on this earth, regardless of race or creed or color. There was particular emphasis in the Family of Man exhibition on the family, the literal family, on family groups, on family relationships. And there were very many images of husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, extended family groups, parents and children, many, many images of children, including that final image in the there. Some of you may recognize this. This is this famous photograph taken in 1946 by Eugene Smith entitled The Walk to Paradise Garden. It depicts his two children, as you can see, walking out of the darkness towards the light. That was the very final image in this exhibition, and it's the final image in the catalogue as well. So in this exhibition, entitled The Family of Man, we see that the eponymous Family of Man worked at two levels. At one level, it was a metaphor in which humanity was redescribed as all one big family, encompassing the entire world. At another level, it was an invitation to repose faith in the family, the literal family, as that which could heal a fractured and dangerous world. And remember, we're talking about 1955. So you need to think about the Cold War, you need to think about the threat of nuclear annihilation. You also need to think about social change and the feelings of anxiety associated with the changing role at that time of women in the United States, and so on. So the idea of the family as that which could allay fears and root people, anchor people, and give them security, tranquility, and stability. So the idea was that it was inviting viewers to repose faith in the family. But which family? Which family? If indeed the family is not self-evident, universal, and uniform throughout the world, we have to ask that question, as indeed many analysts and commentators of this exhibition did. And for quite a number of them, a striking feature of the exhibition was that it largely universalized the bourgeois nuclear family. Not entirely, as you see. We see other kinds of family groups, but overall, it was the family that would comprise a heterosexual married couple and their children, which was presented in the various images in this exhibition as more or less the essential family form. Well, after the exhibition closed in New York, versions of it went on tour all around the world. And one of the earliest stops was Paris, where it was visited by the critical theorist Roland Barthes. Some of you may be familiar with his book, Mythologie, his work on semiotics. That's him. And Barthes was one of those who wrote about this exhibition, and he wrote about it rather critically, not so much only because of the way in which it universalized this very specific family form, but more broadly, he was critical of Steichen's ambition to present a mirror of universal humanity as if there was such a thing. Everything here, Barthes wrote, and I'm now quoting, "The content and appeal of the pictures and the discourse which justifies them aims to suppress the determining weight of history." Overall, Barthes' judgment was that this exhibition made human actions, as he put it, look eternal, the better to diffuse their political potency. The real issues, he said, were not about eternal childhood and the sameness of childhood throughout the world, but whether or not children are threatened by a high mortality rate, whether or not a particular type of future is open to them. That's what a photographic exhibition should be telling people, he said, instead of the eternal lyricism of childhood and the family. And he went on to refer to a case, a terrible case which had been reported from the United States earlier the same year. A 14-year-old black boy called Emmett Till had been lynched in Mississippi, and his killers had been acquitted by an all-white jury, only to later boast of the crime themselves. And so, having read about this rather recently, Barthes says, why not ask the mother of Emmett Till what she thinks of the eternal essence and pretended unity of humankind? So Barthes calling into question this idea of universal humanity and reminding us that we need to think about the divisions and hierarchies that are also an aspect of social reality. Of course, this exhibition and Barthes' critique are also artifacts of their time and place and also shouldn't be eternalized. But if we put Barthes' critique alongside the passages from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that I put up on the screen, I think we can take from him a reminder that abstracting human affairs from history and politics and insisting on the essential oneness of all humanity doesn't put an end to social divisions and inequalities and the hierarchies they carry forward, like the racial divisions that were so palpable and so patent in the case of Emmett Till. It doesn't put an end to those divisions, it simply invisibilizes them. It simply elides them, masks them from view. So let's move on to the second trope that I'm wanting to highlight, which is the concept of the family of nations. Today, we don't use the phrase family of nations. We tend to talk about the international community, or sometimes we refer to the international system. But from the end of the 18th century until the Second World War, it seems that the family of nations was the favored concept for talking about states considered collectively. It's been suggested that this idea of conceptualizing international society as a family can be traced to the German writer and scholar Friedrich Schiller, who spoke at his inaugural lecture for the University of Jena in 1789 of how the European society of states seems transformed into one great family, eine große Familie. In the work of 19th century international legal scholars, the concept of the family of nations became linked with the standard of civilization as the formal mechanism by which European states arrogated to themselves the right to grant or deny international status, delimit the application of international norms, and more generally, calibrate the rights and duties of sovereign statehood. So, for example, the British jurist T.J. Lawrence wrote in his Principles of International Law, published in 1895, that, now quoting, membership in the family of nations is restricted to those who possess certain characteristics. And notably, he went on to say that a certain degree of civilization is necessary, though it's difficult to determine the exact amount. Writing at the beginning of the 20th century, the German-British jurist Lasse Oppenheim provided perhaps the fullest account in English of the family of nations and its significance and history. Oppenheim informed his readers that, I'm now quoting, for many hundreds of years, the community of civilized states has been called family of nations. He's exaggerating the time frame there. We know that it really doesn't go back much beyond the late 18th century, but there you are. Anyway, he says that community of civilized states has been called the family of nations, and he says this was originally the product of Christian civilization, but over time it had been extended to civilized states beyond Christendom insofar as, again quoting, states which have hitherto formed the family of nations have consented to the reception of new members. In the light of that progressive extension, Oppenheim proposed that states could be classified by reference to their successive entrances into the family of nations. So first, he said you have the old Christian states of Western Europe. Then he says you have the Christian states that grew up outside Europe, the United States, and the former colonies of Latin America. Then he says you have Turkey and Japan, and then he mentions some other complicated or doubtful cases. Although colonized peoples remained outside the family of nations, it's notable for our purposes that familial language was again used to express relations with them. Specifically, colonized nations were assimilated to children in need of paternal direction. This was no hidden secret of imperial ideology. To refer again to India, the historian Uday Mehta has written that, quoting, "Childhood is a theme that runs through the writings of British liberals on India with unerring constancy." So from James Mill's depiction of India as a land in the infancy of the progress of civilization, to Thomas Macaulay's call for the British to be like fathers, who are at times just and unjust, moderate and rapacious, to John Stuart Mill, younger Mill's belief in British rule as a means of gradually training people to walk alone. All coalesce, says Mehta, around the same general point. India is a child for which the empire offers the prospect of legitimate and progressive parentage, and towards which Britain, as a parent, is similarly obligated and competent. The anthropologist Anne McClintock has a fascinating reading of the Victorian bestseller King Solomon's Mines by Henry Rider Haggard, which she portrays as a dramatization of the theme of the white father as the head of the global family of man. At a later moment, the mandate system of the League of Nations, set up under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, operated under the sign of that figure too, with its emphasis on the tutelage of peoples. This is quoting from Article 22, of peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. Later still, when in 1949, the Commonwealth of Nations, formerly known as the British Commonwealth of Nations, was constituted as a mechanism by which the United Kingdom could retain ties with newly independent India, despite India's assumption of republican status, the white pater familias was in evidence again. As we learn from one account of these events, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Clement Attlee was able to, and I'm now quoting from a statement of the time, able to maneuver the figure of the king from an abstract symbol connoting authority into a father figure and effectively reinvent the family trope as a metaphor for unity. In post-colonial times, the Commonwealth is indeed the context where, at least in English, the language of the family of nations is most often heard. I say this as somebody originally from Australia, but now living in the UK. So 2 countries that are part of this grouping. It seems that the concept of the family of nations was held especially dear by the late Queen, who, in the first of her annual Christmas broadcasts, which took place in 1952, addressed the British nation with the following words: "We belong, you and I, to a far larger family, the British Commonwealth and Empire, that immense union of nations, with their homes set in all 4 corners of the earth." 1952, remember? So before the big spate of decolonization in the 1960s. So that immense union of nations, she says, with their homes set in all 4 corners of the earth, like our own families, it can be a great power for good, she said. But if the Commonwealth and Empire were not just a family of nations, but also a family of families, it's necessary to recall that only 2 months before Elizabeth II made that speech, so Christmas, December 1952, in October 1952, the British government had declared a state of emergency in Kenya, unleashing against the Mau Mau the most ferocious violence at the hands of their enraged and unsparing father. This presumptive metaphor for unity that Attlee was seeking to parlay into the new Commonwealth was certainly not a metaphor for equality any more than it was a metaphor for respect, reciprocity, or non-violence. Underlying these investments in the family of nations is an idea of childhood as the developmental past of the mature adult. Yet, even as childhood has been used in that progressive or evolutionary, quasi-evolutionary way to evoke our past, we know that it has equally been used to symbolize our future. So used for the colonized to refer to the idea that they need to be helped to grow up, in John Stuart Mill's words, trained so that they would one day walk alone, In other contexts, we know that children are used to symbolize our future, and that is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the present-day discourses relating to climate change, where the constant refrain is, of course, of averting or limiting catastrophe for the sake of our children. Likewise, the image-making associated with climate change places children front and center. At the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, EU Vice President Frans Timmermans is reported to have held up a photograph on his phone of a one-year-old child, declaring, "If we fail, my grandson will fight with other human beings for water and food." So 1.5 degrees Celsius is about avoiding a future for our children and grandchildren that is unlivable. Against that background, let us now take up the third and final of the family-related tropes I want to discuss, the idea of the child as the future, or the child, in another common formulation, as the symbol of future generations. Here, of course, we're in the realm not so much of metaphor as of metonymy. So as with metaphor, metonymy involves substitution, or the description of one thing in terms of another. But rather than being invited to compare or analogize, as we are with metaphor, rather than being invited to say that one thing is effectively like another and therefore can be compared to another, with metonymy, we're encouraged to notice association or contiguity. By definition, no one can be in the future, but underpinning this trope is the idea that the child is close to the future. The child is, in some sense, future adjacent. The point of foregrounding the child in talk about climate change is obviously to highlight the urgency of the problem by bringing a phenomenon with long-range effects into the near future. Foregrounding the child is presumably also a way of mobilizing action to address climate change by identifying inaction or inadequate action with parental irresponsibility. And a further advantage of foregrounding the child in this context might be that it serves to create some basis for optimism. According to a centuries-old strand of thought, childhood is identified with innocence, purity, and uncorrupted nature. So putting the child at the center of climate change discourse seems to be a way of evoking the possibility of reversing the corruption of our world, stepping out from the darkness of global warming, like the children in Eugene Smith's photo, and allowing us to be carefree and joyful once again. It's therefore no surprise that the trope of the child has proved attractive to those engaged in climate change activism and norm setting. But again, I think we need to pause over this way of framing things. One of my LSE colleagues, Stephen Humphreys, writing in the European Journal of International Law, has made valuable arguments that I think are relevant here about the emphasis on future generations and how, in at least some versions of this, it may unhelpfully divert attention from the uneven impacts, historic legacies, and indeed current realities of climate change, making it seem as if the problem was all about our children, a vast undifferentiated mass that is supposed to incarnate the impacts of climate change. But in addition to that set of points, I want to highlight the familiar idea that climate change is a project of salvation undertaken with children at the forefront of our minds. An example of that appeared in media coverage of COP28 in Dubai, where children were shown holding up a banner with "Save the World" printed on it in primary colored letters. In accounting for the salvationary narrative that subtends the trope of the child as the future, the US English literature scholar Rebecca Sheldon has proposed that despite the fact that children's own activism is itself often involved, the concern here for the future of the child is ultimately a concern not so much for children in themselves as for their reproductive potential. That is to say, their capacity to follow a life script that includes eventually becoming parents, eventually having children of their own. Here she draws on work by Lee Edelman, who in his 2004 book, No Future, coined the phrase reproductive futurism to refer to the idea that the only futures which children are permitted to have are those passed on to children of their own. Of course, species survival is hardly an unimportant matter, and evolutionary theory tells us that it has its own logic. But Edelman wants to challenge, I think, the idea that species survival needs to be the beginning and end, the alpha and omega of all considerations of or dispositions towards the future. Reflecting on this conjunction of parenthood and environmental stewardship, Sarah Ensor highlights a more recent book by Sandra Steingraber entitled Raising Elijah, and the subtitle is Protecting Our Children in a Time of Environmental Crisis, where Steingraber makes the argument that I'm now quoting, the environmental crisis is a parenting crisis. It undermines my ability to carry out two fundamental duties, to protect my children from harm and to plan for their future. End of quote. As Ensor summarizes the book, Steingraber's response to this situation is, now quoting from Ensor, to redouble this author's efforts to quarantine her children from the dangers and toxicities they face. So, for example, to feed them organic food only, to exclude all PVC plastic from their homes, and so on. Ensor wants us to consider the way climate change activism can become a matter of seeing to your own interests if and to the extent that you have the privilege of doing so. That is to say, she wants us again to notice the way asymmetries in society may form the taken for granted and hence unchallenged context of some, not of course all, but some approaches to climate change activism. Well, let me now try to draw together the threads of what I've been discussing and propose some conclusions. I've raised the question of what it means to represent the world as a family, how it affects our understanding of both the world and the family. One answer might be to say there are no effects. Speaking of the world as a family is just a piece of empty verbiage that shouldn't be taken too seriously. But that answer cannot stand, since as we've seen, this way of representing things does have consequences. In the first place, we've seen how the effort to insist on the essential commonality and unity of humanity by representing all human beings as belonging to one family can risk invisibilizing actual social divisions and the inequalities and hierarchies they involve. Secondly, we've seen how in the in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the concept of the family of nations was used in tandem with the concept of the civilizing mission to justify the subjugation, exploitation, and ill treatment of colonized peoples. And thirdly, we've seen how the invocation of the child as the stand-in for future generations in contemporary climate change discourse may be helping to rationalize salvationary, self-centered, and prevaricative approaches to dealing with that pressing global problem. At the same time, we've seen how under the guise of a family that's timeless, universal, and self-evident, representations of the world as a family pick out and in the process privilege and normalize historically specific and always contested notions of what a family is, what kind of family deserves accreditation as such. The post-war nuclear family of the heterosexual married couple and their children, perhaps, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is concerned. The Victorian family with its stern disciplinarian father of long 19th century England, where the concept of the family of nations is concerned, perhaps. And perhaps the middle-class millennial parented family of Western societies, in the current era, where the child as the emblem of the future in climate change discourse is concerned. It's important to acknowledge that these things are not all that familial language and the beliefs and actions associated with it can do and have done. The language of black brothers and sisters has long been a feature of African American emancipatory discourses in the United States, and the language of sisterhood has, of course, also been central in feminist organizing, to give just two more positive, though also, it has to be said, contested examples. But while we always need to keep in mind that things do not only travel in one direction, so to speak, the general point here is that we need to be cautious about this metaphor of the family and these familial metonyms and their place in international affairs. I spoke at the beginning of this lecture about the ongoing conflict in South Asia between India and Pakistan, which recently erupted in the wake of the Pahalgam attack. And I mentioned that according to one writer, the story of India-Pakistan relations is to be told as the story of a fractured fraternity and hence of a broken family. Well, to restate my point in more specific terms and with reference to that particular situation, I want to acknowledge the tremendous power and deep resonance of the imagery on which the writer of that book draws, something I'm very aware of in India, where the aspiration is to fraternity in much public discourse. So I want to acknowledge the power and resonance of this image, but I also want to call it into question. If the story of India-Pakistan relations is narrated as a fractured fraternity, I want to suggest that it's not completely clear that the establishment or re-establishment of familial integrity and loving brotherhood is a helpful way of framing the path to peace between those two countries. Thank you.